This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
How many of you remember Kyoto?
Okay, how did you hear about it? Newspapers, TV? Any of you remember the ads that you'd see on television watching football games back in the fall of 1997? There was this sort of middle American couple sitting there, and the woman says, you know, I care as much about the environment as anybody else, you know, and I worry about things like global warming, but... And then, meanwhile, while they're having this conversation, there's the scissors, and they're cutting up this folded piece of paper. Yeah, this ad was on quite a lot back then. And they continue to talk about it, and even though nobody's sure it's a real problem, we still should be concerned, she said, but if we're going to have an agreement, it has to work and it has to be fair. And then they open the paper up, and it's a map of the world in which all the developing countries have been cut out, right? So it's mostly missing. And then, of course, the caption is, the treaty doesn't make everybody everybody participate equally. It's not fair, and it won't work. You know, and this went on and on. And in fact, it was on CNN, and Ted Turner knew it was a polemic, pulled it off, and got sued, or was threatened to be sued, and his lawyers insisted he put it back. You know, and they said people have, you know, that this is a country in which the First Amendment gives you an absolute right to distort, and that's exactly right. Every fact in there was true. The treaty was not requiring everybody. It's their opinion that it won't work, and therefore there's no reason why he cannot just arbitrarily choose not to put this ad on. So because he knew things it left out. So that was part of what the atmosphere was like. In July of '97. When the Clinton administration realized it actually had to go to Kyoto in December and had better think about this problem, they put on a little show in the White House in the East Room, where 6 of us, I was one of them, you know, presented the science and policy implications to the president and vice president, which asked questions. Of course, the vice president knew all this stuff 12 years ago, we go through this little exercise, and that very same day, the Senate passes 95-0 the Byrd-Hague Amendment. Anybody know what that is? That said, it was the sense of the Senate, 95-0, that any climate treaty that did not include meaningful representation of developing countries, that only had targets for the rich countries, would not be ratified by the Senate. And this was a great act of fairness to the American workers, they claimed. Now, what all that neglected, obviously, is that 80% of the emissions in the last 50 years have come from the very countries that were being targeted for the targets, and that the per capita use of fossil fuels is about a factor of 10 to 20 different between the rich countries and the poorer countries that were cut out of the map. And therefore, almost anybody with any sense of decency would reach the conclusion that in the initial phases, at least, the ones who created most of the problem and are wealthiest would take the first step to demonstrate seriousness. And that actually has a name. It's called the Berlin Mandate, because it happened at one of the COPs, right? Conference of the Parties. Which one? Was that 2?
I think it was
3 was Kyoto. Maybe it was 1. Whichever one it was. And so therefore, this was very convenient. You know, in the name of protecting the American worker, they were going to ignore 50 years of history and the differential status. The analogy I used at the time was, it's the old level playing field argument. All of a sudden now, the argument we made, wait a minute, we have to do something about dumping in the atmosphere. So we have to be fair, everybody has to do it all at once. So it's as if you discovered that you'd played the first quarter on a tilted playing field, and the team with the advantage has been running downhill. As they're about to score on the 5-yard line, the referee notices the field is tilted. They restore the field, but they don't even give them a penalty back to the 25. You know, it's as if all of a sudden everything is now equal and we've forgotten the last 50 years. And the fact that the Senate voted that 95-0 was, to me, an amazing disappointment that that kind of domestic pandering, you know, took place over what almost anybody looking at this problem in a detached way would consider an indecency. So, in my view at least, what did that do is that put a lot of pressure on the administration, because they actually wanted to do something about the problem, but they were political animals, so therefore they had to take a look at what was possible. And then they had a tough job, because they had to decide between doing what they thought is right and doing what they thought had a chance to be ratified in the Senate. And not long after that meeting ended, I went up to talk to the vice president, who I knew quite well for a long time, from lots of battles through the 80s. I testified to his very first global warming hearing in 1981, when the Reagan administration came in and they slashed the budgets in almost all environmental research, on the grounds that if it had the word environmental or social in it, it was in their mandate from their massive election to cut it out. And that was the nature of their intelligent, you know, and well-reasoned decision. It was word environment, gone, Stockman, cross it out. So Gore excoriated them, you know, the DOE. We had a rather entertainingly angry hearing. The transcript was kind of fun reading. But so ever since, he was a trooper for this issue. So some of us were kind of disappointed that it was so quiet during the 90s, and all of a sudden they finally got back into it in a big way 6 months before the treaty negotiations. Now, it takes a long time to get the public preconditioned to doing something out of their experience, and that probably wasn't going to be enough. So at the end of this, I go up and I talk to him, and I said, well, Mr. Vice President, it's a pleasure to call you that, because last time we spoke was probably in '92, when we were dealing with all these wars in the Senate. And it was all very pleasant, and I said, and I see that the Senate wars aren't over, because just today they passed the Byrd-Hagel amendments. Why, I told you the story. And he says, yeah, I know it's a mess. And I said, but when you go to Kyoto, just remember, Jesse Helms is not a young man. Senates come and Senates go. Do the right thing for history. He says, yeah, Steve, real easy for you to say. But when he went to Kyoto, Eddie got there and he announced flexible negotiating position for the U.S., and he committed the U.S. delegation to agree to the 7% cuts, knowing full well he had zero chance to get them through the Senate. So I saw him actually about a year and a half later, another meeting. I said, thanks for doing the right thing for history. And he says, yeah, but we're not going to get it through the Senate. And I said, well, you have to have a scientist's perspective on this. If you take a look at the Kyoto Protocol with, you've all looked at this here yet? Okay. So what are the rich countries supposed to cut on the order of about 6%, something like that, below the 1990 emissions? Supposing we do that, and the rest of the world proceeds down what's called business as usual, a very high growth path, a lot of coal use in India and China, this sort of thing. We stay on the sport utility vehicle, or as we like to call them, the urban assault vehicle kick, and what happens? CO2 emissions, if we reduce our emissions back to 1990 levels, what happens to emissions in 2100? Anybody have any idea before I show you the answer? Let me find the answer.
Think in terms of multiples.
Right.
Well, they go down overall if
the emissions go down. Well, what about the developing countries? They're projected to triple their or quadruple their economies, And even though they're going to be more energy efficient, and I'll show you some pictures of that later on, what's going to happen to using the atmosphere as a sewer? And what happens in the rich countries? They're going down, but they're not zero. So it turns out that if that happens, relative to a classic business as usual profile, at 2100, there we go. Okay, I hate pictures with small things, especially when you have cameras. So I'll tell you what it says. This says temperature change in degrees C, and this is 1. That's 2. Okay, this is time starting from 1990 and going out to 2100. So these are projections using computer models. The top curve is called IS92A, which stands for the IPCC scenarios constructed in 92, scenario A. That's the classical business as usual. And what it suggests is a warming of nearly 2 degrees. Now remember, this should really be somewhere between here and up in the top of the room because there's lots of uncertainty. But let's just take the best guess case. So you get this 2 degree or so warming. Here's Kyoto. Something like 1/10 of a degree less. It makes almost no difference. Here's extended Kyoto. Extended Kyoto means the rich countries continue reducing by 1% per year every year after 2010. It still doesn't make that much difference. The reason for that is if the entire world magically emitted tomorrow and every day thereafter exactly the amount of CO2 they emit today, the concentrations continue to build up indefinitely until the removal from the atmosphere by larger biosphere, for example, equals that extra increment of emissions. It just keeps building up. Emissions eventually have to go to zero. Eventually, it could be a couple hundred years. They have to be cut by probably 50 or more percent to be able to stabilize at maybe 450 parts per million. Right now we're at 360, and pre-industrial we're at 280. So what Kyoto is an early step. Now it's very difficult to sell people a radical transformation in the props of industrial civilization, namely fossil energy, all at once. Yet, now I'm going to jump ahead to The Hague and talk about that in a minute. Here I was at The Hague listening to this passionate debate between some industrial people and some developing countries on the one hand arguing that any reduction whatever is going to harm people's development paths, and Greenpeace on the other insisting on absolute, total, strict adherence to the letter of Kyoto as if the fate of the world depended on absolutely every compliance and that every single drop of those cuts had to be made domestically. And what I basically said is, you know, a strong Kyoto, over which we're so passionately engaged, versus a weak Kyoto, is a difference between 1/10 and 2/10 of a degree reduction in 2100. Kyoto is a very early step, and what's critically important is not whether this agreement is weak or strong, or even what we do in the next 15 years to cut emissions. It's what we do to change the nature of the structure of the economy over the next 50 years so we no longer have dependence on these technologies that emit into the atmosphere. Therefore, the more orderly that transition, the lower its cost, the higher the political likelihood we can get it ratified and get on with the job. So doing a lot in a hurry is actually counterproductive, because what it will do is it'll look expensive, turn people off, lead to the cacophony we have, and we get nothing. So my view was it wasn't important whether the targets were strong or weak. What was important is that the underlying rules create incentives for people to get off the track we're on. Quite simply, if we repeat the Victorian Industrial Revolution in the developing world with sweatshops and polluted cities and inefficient technologies, there's no way to prevent massive potential for climate change. It's got to change. And you cannot expect the people who are a factor of 10 per capita less in consumption to take the first steps or even equal steps. That has to come over time, and coming over time means through the process of cooperation. So what we need is a generational experiment in a whole new idea, which is not competitiveness, which is the standard idea in every country, but cooperation. And to me, I don't care what we cut in the next 10 years. I care that we begin that process of getting the cooperative mechanisms in place so that the really large cuts that are essential over the next 50 years take place, and they have to do that in an orderly way that allows people to buy into it. And that's not a trivial assignment. So there's a quick jump ahead.
This article that you got from the New York Times is talking about this IPCC. This is from today's New York Times, talking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, putting out their new
the story of what's going on in Shanghai.
Yes, I was just going to say.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be there. I'm a bad guy. I didn't go. I'm going to the one in February in Working Group 2. Working Group 2 is impacts and adaptation and vulnerability. Working Group 1 is the climate science. There's only so much of only so much of your life you can give. Okay, let me.
Enough of his life to cover most.
I was in China last week, but for a different reason, because the Chinese put on a globalization forum, which was very interesting. Actually, a slight diversion. They want to get into the IT world in a big way. And they were talking about, viewing globalization as an IT issue. And of course, along with this came some very fascinating debates between sort of senior party operatives spouting warmed over Marxism. And then the young Turks were getting up there, and they were talking Chinese entrepreneurs, many of whom were educated in Stanford. And they were just out there and saying, if our country keeps people with attitude like you, we'll be backward in the Stone Age forever. We've got to change things. It has to open up. It was really quite spectacular dialogue. They were shouting at each other. It was great. I just looked like I was home again. And with a translator. The translators, you could tell, were a little embarrassed because this is not the normal thing. And it's all okay. Don't do it in Tiananmen Square, to the reporters. But the fact that that kind of dialogue took place, a number of us were very pleased with it. And anyhow, when I got my short talk, what I said is, I'm glad to see that you're all interested in globalization and IT. But the problem isn't just IT. It's AT, FT, HT, and ET. And I don't mean by that a Spielberg movie. So AT, agricultural technology, right? FT, forestry techniques. HT, health technology. And ET, the biggie, energy technology. Because what information technology is about is it's a tool for being more efficient in delivery of the services people need. And therefore, they were arguing, and trying to get their hands around this broad problem called information. And I told them it was just the tip of the iceberg. The real problem was really all the classical ones, which is involved in sustainable development, and that's what they need to deal with. Well, anyhow, it was agreed that was true. But it was a remarkable event, and I kind of put that one higher in the priority than going to this plenary. But I'm kind of curious what's going on there. Okay, so let's go back to the question you asked me to talk about, how the role of science gets in there. But before we do the role of science, let me do the, the role of the political situation. I guess we have to have the lights, don't we? All right. Well, you
need the lights still on.
Well, it's probably the other ones that are going to signal noise ratio. This is the building at which the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. So when you walk up to that building, you could not but avoid seeing this little theater. And anybody see this little thing? Doesn't look like much. Just looks like some small person standing there. Well, here was that small person. That small person was a penguin carved in ice, which therefore was going to melt at the feet of the delegates. And it says something about Antarctica disappearing, don't take away my home. The rich get richer while we're getting hotter. Al Gore, cut GHGs, greenhouse gases now, or go home, all this stuff. And so the whole place was a cacophony. There was these various tribes. This was Greenpeace's, I love this. This was the fossil fuel dinosaur. And this was outside, greeted all the delegates. And you take a careful look at the fossil fuel dinosaur. So here's a Fina gas can and a Ford radiator, and they got everybody involved. It's pretty clever. And you could not help but be assaulted by all sorts of people with all sorts of positions. There were posters and placards, and it was a cross between a carnival and a political rally. It was not angry, but it was pretty cacophonous. That was one tribe. The other tribe were the three-piece suits with very glitzy literature, putting their arms around delegates and reporters, and that tended to be the Global Climate Coalition and the and the industrial lobbyists. So I wrote a little article where I changed the word NGO, right, the non-governmental organization, into NGOs and INGOs, right, the environmental NGOs and the industrial NGOs, and because they had such radically different styles. No doubt the NGOs won the PR battle, but the INGOs were in there lobbying the important folks. And all this was going on, and once in a while, in the middle of this 10,000 people there in this cacophony, there were a session. This was, I think, Al Gore's presentation. Most of the time, nobody was in the sessions because they were broadcast on TV all over the place. The bulk of the work is taking place in side rooms, dozens and dozens of them. Scheduling this was a nightmare. And so what you had to do is schedule all these meetings in all these side rooms. Some meetings were closed to anybody who didn't have a pink badge. That makes you a national delegate. Other meetings were open, involved media and so forth. I was in quite a few of those, including one called Does Science Matter, which I'll tell you about, which you asked me to talk about, Ron, in a few minutes. But those meetings were going on continuously. So there was open negotiations, closed negotiations, and then open discussions on a range of issues. All at once, with 1,000 reporters there. And this typical scene in the workroom, these were somebody's laptops, cell phones. I mean, I was running around giving my speech, which is that if we're going to solve this problem, we're not going to repeat the Victorian Industrial Revolution. We're going to have to do in energy what the Chinese have already done in communications, which is to leapfrog over the Victorian Industrial Revolution. They're not stretching copper wires all over their country and waiting before everybody talks to each other. I was just in Hainan, which is the southernmost province, and I was driving up into the mountains to try to find some rare and endangered birds, which I didn't. But in any case, drove through back villages that didn't have wires, and they all had a cell phone tower. And that's perfectly okay, just exactly right. People can talk to each other. So they leapfrogged over that Victorian Industrial Revolution of wiring the place with copper, and you got to do the same thing. You can't repeat coal and internal combustion engines. So that leapfrogging, however, is not free. It takes expertise. Other people have the intellectual property. How do you get them into the game? How do you get coalitions between people who have those technologies but don't know how to apply them in the local context? And nobody knows how to build an infrastructure for fuel cell cars. I mean, if the Martians exist, they came down tomorrow to give us the most efficient fuel cell car with a cheap catalyst. We couldn't build it in 5 minutes because we don't have the factories to do it. We don't have the trained workers to do it. We don't know who to service it. We don't know how to convince people to buy it. And we have to deal with all the political resistance from those people who lose their jobs doing it the old way. So it takes a generation at least for that kind of infrastructural change. And therefore, that's why I keep saying over and over again, got to start, got to start, got to start, and that we'll make it perfect later. Let's start. In any case, this was going on, all this communication and cacophony. That was on the outside. Meanwhile, on the inside. On the outside was stuff like this. The exempt nations, this was the global warming special, and poor old Uncle Sam puffing away and huffing away. That, by the way, was in a column written by, one of my favorites, George Will. I do media training for people, and I always say never be facetious when you're on television because somebody will think you really meant it. He's not one of my favorites. Anyhow, here he's got the headline, that's where the cartoon was, On Climate and Race, Government Meddles Where It Should Not. Now we teach environmental policy here, and one of the things that we always try to do is make people see the difference between private decisions and public decisions, that is, between private costs and social costs, and between normative and positive, the factual type statements. And what amazes me about that is that what is the climate change problem? It's the collective impact of billions of private, individual, corporate, and national decisions. where there's no incentive for those individuals not to dump in the atmosphere. So it is precisely the kind of problem where the government not only must meddle, but has to operate, because you cannot manage a commons at the scale of the planet by individual decisions, except to the extent that those individuals either volunteer to be good citizens or have incentives like a tax applied, in more than one place to give them incentive. So as usual, George Will gets it backwards. But the point is, this was part of the political debate that's going on. What was not going on was in this column or in the Byrd Amendments what I told you before. Come on, I'm a scientist. I can't just tell you. I got to show you some numbers. So here, $1990 to 2100 billion metric tons of carbon per year. That's the CO2 emissions. And this is the business as usual scenario. This is the total. So here we are now, around 7 billion tons per year of carbon, not carbon dioxide. This is very standard confusion. Carbon dioxide, CO2, whose molecular weight is higher than C. So this is the lower number. This is the tons of carbon as carbon dioxide. It's projected to go up in the business as usual to around 20. That is a CO2 tripling or quadrupling by the 22nd century. The business as usual is a massive change. This is the developed countries' projection. Here's the developing countries' projection. So you end up at the irony at Kyoto that those forward-looking progressive entities known as fossil fuel companies only could talk about the future, and that the developing countries were going to be the dominant factor, and therefore they, the producers of this product in the rich countries, weren't going to be responsible for the bulk of the problem. It's a developing country problem, they said. And of course, the developing countries, who like to think of themselves often as being progressive, could only look backwards at the larger share of the other ones. And I keep there saying, this is a planetary problem. One group's been initially responsible, has to take the initial thing. The next group is going to be responsible, so why don't we gear up now and make it cheaper to fix it by starting sooner and along a progressive path? And that's the difficulty. The blame was everywhere. And of course, it was looking forward or backward depending upon which perspective. So that's the key. Remember, you've got a quarter of the population in here and 3/4 in here. So when you divide it out per capita, it's pretty obvious, who has a better capacity to mitigate. And that's precisely why the Berlin Mandate said that the richer countries should take the first steps. The problem is, if only the richer countries take steps, it's virtually not effective. It's only a small cut. And therefore, a number of people argued who don't want to do anything. Well, it's not going to make much difference, so why should we do anything? As opposed to, how can we figure out a way to make a lot of difference? Now, let me go on. Also at that time, more media nonsense. This was the Wall Street Journal editorial. I mentioned this one because it was mailed out to about 300,000 scientists. By scientists, I mean people who are members of scientific societies. And then it included a petition from the former president of the National Academy of Sciences, Fred Seitz, saying that the Kyoto Treaty wasn't fair and wouldn't work, and climate change wasn't a proven problem, and therefore why should we take these draconian steps that will wreck the economy of the world and hurt the American worker? And they got 17,000 signatures back out of these 300,000, and they presented those to Congress as a proof that 17,000 experts think this is a crazy idea to be dealing with, whereas only 2,000 people are associated with IPCC. And of course, this was then paraded by various champions of those causes in the Senate. And I got several press phone calls at the time asking me about that. And they said, well, what do you say to that? I mean, there's only 2,000 people associated with the IPCC, and here are these 17,000 people who signed this petition. And I said, well, I have a slight arrhythmia, and I'm always looking for relatively mild medicines to deal with it. So what I guess I should do is think that all medical degrees are created equal. So the next time I have to worry about this little arrhythmia, instead of finding one of the 500 cardiologists, why don't I go to any one of the tens of thousands of dentists or podiatrists or other people out there? They all have medical degrees. They're all experts, right? And when I have a toothache, if I happen to be in my cardiologist's office, I'll just ask him to fix it, and I won't bother to go to the dentist who actually knows something about it. I said, people in scientific societies are not remotely qualified to make judgments about the relative likelihood that will be 1 degree or 4 degrees. Every person is equally qualified to decide whether they want to take that risk, because that's not a positive statement. That's a normative statement, right? That's a value judgment about whether you fear more large changes in the environment or you fear more slower rates of economic development. Those are the kinds of trade-offs that we have to make personal judgments about. But those judgments have no meaning if we don't have any understanding about what can happen and what the odds are that it'll happen. That's the science role. So these folks were basically the 17,000 out of hundreds of thousands who fit the ideology of Fred Seitz. And that's all it was measuring. So therefore, I'll claim that the vast bulk of the people they sent to, which they wouldn't tell us how many, have opposite ideology. It tells you nothing about the science. You want to figure out about the science, you have to bring together the people who know something about it from a variety of perspectives and let them fight it out. And that's exactly what IPCC does. Anyhow, this was mailed out, as I said, to hundreds of thousands of people. This was put into the congressional record. It was written by 2 chemists, Arthur and Zachary Robinson, from this little small, they have a garage in Cave Junction, Oregon, the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, and they don't do research. They write op-ed pieces and they testify to Congress, and they're propped up with oil money and OPEC money. Anyhow, that's ad hominem. We have to answer it. Can't just do that, right? You have to say what they said. So, they said that in science, the ultimate test is the process of experiment. Everybody buy that? If you want to, anybody here ever read Popper? Karl Popper? And he's the guru of the mythology of objective science. And that is that what we do is we falsify. You have an idea. You now subject it to a test. If it passes the test, it's still not true. You're subjected to another test. And in each attempt to falsify that fails increases your confidence in the theory. Actually, that's pretty good, and that's what science does. The problem is falsification is only possible on very limited sets of problems where you have clear answers, where there's not a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in the measurement, and where there aren't multiple causal factors that you can only test a few at a time. We're talking the climate here. It doesn't fit any of those characteristics. It is not possible to falsify the climate. All you can do is subdivide the climate system into little subcomponents, hundreds of them, test each one at a time, and the more of them that line up with your intuition and your experiments line up, the higher your confidence is that the aggregate prediction is reasonable. That's precisely how the community works. It's the difference between what's called a subjective and an objective opinion. Okay. Probability that is ahead. Probability that this coin is ahead, 50, what? 50%, right. How did you know?
There's 2 possibilities.
2 possibilities. She is a theorist. That is a theoretical prediction. All right, anybody here does not understand the nature of coinness, but still wants to figure out the probability. How can you do it?
Just keep flipping.
Keep flipping. All right. He is a frequentist. You see, you should have been a Popperian, right? So what you do is you draw a chart. You write H and T, head and tail. You flip. Check, 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 check. You count it up and do a frequency chart. And then over time, you determine the probabilities. There's a name for that. That's called frequentist statistics, the number of frequencies. This is the ideal, the archetype under which science operates. We get the data, the facts. That's precisely the way we should try to be whenever we can.
That's what I'm teaching them in this class.
What? To get the data and the facts?
To get the data and the facts.
All right. Now, the problem is the data and the facts are usually only applied to such small elements of a complex problem that you never can get them for the big one anyway, and you end up with a subjective judgment. That makes you into another kind of statistical person. It's called a Bayesian, after Bayes' theorem. And Bayesians have a whole different way of seeing the world. They say, okay, we've looked at all these facts, we've looked at all these objective determinations, but we realize they are completely insufficient to describe this complex system. There are just components we can't measure, we haven't seen yet. There are too many factors, but we have some information that is objective. these flipped coins or these measurements of temperature, or there are numbers of bits of objective information. So what we're going to do is form them in our brain into a prejudice. That prejudice is called a prior, or it's your prior probability. It's your subjective degree of belief that the system will behave like such, that there'll be 1 degree warming or 3 degrees warming. You can assign a probability to it. Nobody claims that probability is objective. If it were objective, what you would have had to do is flip the climate 500 times. That is, you'd have to have 500 twin Earths, pollute some, not pollute others, do a random experiment. If we could keep that science ideal going, that's what we'd do, and we'd really get a true frequency chart, and it would make those of us in science very happy. We have one experiment, and how do you know the probability that the climate will be 2 degrees warmer 100 years from now? How do you test that? Hang around 100 years and measure it. You can't. What you do is you build twin Earths in the computer. They make mathematical models. And then you make those models have all different degrees of CO2 and other kinds of changes and change the sun. And then you ask them. You can make frequency charts from the models. But now the question isn't what the probability is that the model will make it 3 degrees warmer. The question is, what's the probability that the model's right? That means validating the subcomponents of the model, which is what the community does one at a time, but it's not a complete job. So there's an element of subjectivity. And that element of subjectivity is not inexpert. The Saudis just wrote a big criticism, that's what I want to know. They're trying to get rid of the entire discussion of subjective probabilities, claiming it isn't scientific, showing that they know nothing about science, because science is always subjective. What science is when it deals with systems is it's looking at the combination of subcomponents that are tested, combining with those that aren't tested, and trying to form best guesses as to the likely behavior. It is not a perfect epistemology. It is not one free of values, despite the pretense in science that we're value-free and objective. It's just better than any other one I can think of for trying to arrive at the likelihood that some event will occur in the future. It is not the truth. It's our best social construction of the way the system works, based on as much objective data as we can get and understanding of rules. And since all individuals have different ways of seeing things, it's why it's essential that this kind of science is not done just by experiment, but it's done by collectives of people across a broad range of scientific disciplines and countries who then get together and thrash it out. And that's just what IPCC does. Is it gets hundreds of people together and thrashes out the pros and cons of the importance of these different lines of evidence, and then tries to come up with subjective judgments and ranges of uncertainty. But those probabilities that we're talking about are not objective in the sense of the frequency diagram from the coin, because they still come from judgments of experts. Now, this is not rare. Corporations have to make decisions about investments based on projections of interest rates. There's no objective way to determine the future of interest rates. They're using subjective judgments of opinions of experts, economists. I would trust those opinions more than I would my neighbor. Well, my neighbor is an economist, but all right. More than I would most other neighbors. Stanford doesn't count. The point is, there is a role for expertise. It's just not truth. It's still best guess. Sounds like science by consensus, a reporter said to me the other day. You don't believe in science by experiment, somebody said. You just want to do science by consensus. And my argument back was, no, I do believe in science by experiment. We do as many experiments as we can. But meanwhile, we still have to make decisions. And I believe in science policy by consensus, because we still have to make decisions. We have to decide how to take risks, how to make investments. Therefore, we have to ask the people who have the best possibility of giving us what can happen and what the odds are, what can happen and what are the odds? Then we make the decision about how much risk we want to take and how much we want to invest to hedge against this problem versus how much we want to invest on improving housing or health care. Those are all legitimate competitive uses of limited resources. Therefore, figuring out the likelihoods of events really matters. And that is the right role for experts. Where the whole process gets perverted in the public arena is this kind of stuff. You know, we have a free press and everybody's entitled to spin, and there's no standards of quality enforced. I'm not suggesting we overthrow the First Amendment, But what I am suggesting is that we become literate in how to interpret garbage. I'll show you why this is that in a minute. And there's other garbage that comes to the environmental side as well. But the key is for a society to make a rational judgment about how it wants to take risks, you have to know what can happen and what the odds are. Therefore, you have to tap into the communities that have the best chance of giving you that kind of information, and they are not going to have perfect information in almost any interesting problem. By interesting, I mean it's a complex systems problem. We're going to back in toward that information over time. Okay, so now, let's go back to this. Why do I say this was crappy? In science, the ultimate test is experiment. That's where we started. All right. If a hypothesis fails, the experimental test, it must be discarded. Therefore, the scientific method requires that the global warming hypothesis be rejected. Now, why is that? It's because of this picture. He claims that we falsified it and it's wrong. Global warming is false. Here's hard to read. 1980, this is 1996. This says predicted greenhouse warming and it's a 0.5 degree warming. It's a straight line. This says actual temperature. So they say, well, the model's got it wrong, therefore the theory is wrong, therefore by Popperian standards we reject the hypothesis. Now, it completely neglects the fact that this is not a clean experiment, that the temperature could have been cooling because of natural fluctuations superimposed, that there could have been other factors than warming, that the theory could still be right, but that at the moment there were other things masking it. It's like saying if you have a headache that you can, and you take a pill and it doesn't get immediately better, well, I guess it must be due to something else. Well, there could have been 6 confounding factors before, and you might have to wait a little bit before you can figure out which one was doing it. So, A, they're wrong at the outset because this doesn't reject the theory, and it's even worse than that. This says predicted greenhouse warming, and this is a characterization of a bunch of models. It shows no variability. The models are all filled with variability, so they didn't even accurately represent anything. Second is the actual temperature is not an actual temperature. It's a reconstruction by satellites, which use a model, by the way, to reconstruct the amount of radiant energy given off by oxygen atoms in the microwave frequencies, which tells you the temperature of those atoms, but it forgets to tell you that it's got atoms in the middle of the atmosphere, at the surface, and the stratosphere, all mixed together, and therefore it takes a heroic effort to reconstruct it, and those efforts are not very accurate. So it's a measure of atmospheric temperature, but it isn't even a direct measurement of temperature. It's an inversion through a model. It's a reconstruction. And it's for 3 or 4 miles up in the atmosphere, and this is prediction for the surface temperature. So they're not even commensurate measures. These guys testify to Congress. You know. Anyhow, but weather is so complicated that current data and computer models are insufficient to make such predictions, right? People are trying to use computers to predict the weather, global weather over very long periods. Well, it is difficult to predict. Now, logically, it said these are insufficient to make predictions. Anybody ever see the Farmer's Almanac? Do they make a long-term prediction? Anybody can predict. So let's not, we give them a bad grade in English, but let's assume that they meant insufficient to make credible predictions. All right, we won't attack them on that. We'll impute to them that that's what they meant. Although it is reasonable to hope that these methods eventually become useful, for now computer models are very unreliable. And of course, when you use a word like unreliable, your mind says unreliable for what? The second chart is a predicted temperature of the past 20 years. I've already explained this based on the computer models. It is not surprising they should have turned out wrong. After all, the weatherman still has difficulty predicting local weather even for a few days. Long-term global predictions are beyond current capabilities. Now, does the weather person have difficulty predicting the weather, I'll add the word credibly, past a few days? Yeah, I agree. So never mind they left out credibly. It's really about a week, but okay, I'm not going to quibble. The fundamental point is that the weather system is what we call a chaotic dynamic system. It forgets its initial state within 2 weeks. And in fact, there are unpredictability theorems which say despite the well-paid forecasts of some entrepreneurs who claim they have the secret method to give it to you, and the Farmer's Almanac, most of us in atmospheric science believe it is not possible in principle to predict the detailed evolutionary state of the atmosphere over time. We cannot know over which state a storm will be in 3 weeks from now. So therefore, if you can't predict the weather accurately over 2 weeks, how dare we use the very same computer models we use to predict the weather to predict the climate over 100 years? That's the implication. Do you buy it? They bought it in the Senate. Now, one of you has to testify to the Senate. You want to save the world, right? This is what it's like. You got to go out and you got to fight this stuff. Yeah.
Well, one isn't really predicting the weather, though. If one
Keep
says
going.
CO2 will increase, one isn't saying, well, and therefore there will be a storm over Kansas in 2 years and 4 weeks. But one is saying overall there will be a trend towards higher temperatures. But that's really it.
That's the climate. Climate's a long-term average of weather. Right, you're exactly on track. What they did is a classical bait and switch. You say you can't do the weather, and all of a sudden, therefore, you can't do the climate. It's a bait and switch. And the way I have to deal with this, remember, when you're dealing in the public arena, when you're talking about how do you bring science into the public arena? Well, first of all, you get 20 seconds on the evening news. If any of you saw the Dan Rather program this week, you saw I was on it, and after a half an hour set of interviews, this is about geoengineering. You know, we're going to throw dust in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight in order to balance the greenhouse warming, because that's cheaper than, you know, controlling industrial emissions. And I had a couple of things to say about that. I said, the greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for 200 years, so therefore this climate controlling cadre would have to be continuously injecting dust in the atmosphere for the next 200 years. That suggests to me a rather unprecedented event called global cooperation for 200 years. We haven't had it for more than a few decades. It seems to me a bit risky. But in any case, we did a half an hour interview and I got my 20 seconds, and they actually didn't do a bad job. You know, you just hold your breath when you talk to the media, and you never know which lurid sentence comes out of context to be quoted against somebody else on the other side, the most extreme other side they can get to maintain an entertaining story. But that's not this. This is an opinion piece, not a news piece. And Andy Revkin, by the way, and people like that do a pretty good job of not doing false dichotomy stories, you know, finding the most radical person who says it's the end of the world against the most radical person who says it's good for you, the two lowest probability cases, you know, and then giving you a false dichotomy. So your climate point is exactly right. And so how do I try to get my 20-second soundbite in? I basically said, all right, I'll make anybody in this room a bet, and I will bet $1 million because Paul Hawken has backed me up on this, and that I can make a long-range forecast, climate forecast that's absolutely accurate, and it's this. I'm going to bet you, and since you don't believe long-term forecasts can be made credibly, you should of course be willing to take this bet, take my money away, his money in this case, that, let's say long range, that January of 2003 averaged around the hemisphere is going to be 15 degrees C colder, plus or minus 1, to deal with the unpredictable weather component, than July of 2004. Yes. Nobody's going to bet me on that here either? You don't want to bet me that the winter is cold and the summer is warm? That's funny. It's long-range forecast. We even know what causes it. 100 watts of energy different over every square meter of the Earth. Higher in the summer and lower in the winter. It's amazing. It's a completely deterministic, non-chaotic response. And the reason for that is that the atmosphere has different modes of behavior. The weather is chaotic and loses its memory. The climate is not. Although components of the climate might be, like El Niños. I don't want to give you a blanket statement. But the point is, some aspects are predictable, some aspects are not. And you have to differentiate what we're talking about. Now, how do you get that kind of science injected into a political process that clicks off on long, detailed discussions? That's why we have IPCC, because that's why we have National Research Council studies. They're designed to try to filter for people all that cacophony. And now, in a free society, which we're all so proud of, there's the capacity to have this kind of stuff all the time. And you get equally opposite stuff from Greenpeace and others like that on the other end, although I'm closer to the Greenpeace position than I am to this. But still, they exaggerate. In fact, I'll give you an example. This isn't Greenpeace, but this is... Remember I mentioned that Ted Turner was pretty unhappy about having to carry those ads, so he funded some counters, and he asked an environmental group to put together a map for the back page of the USA Today, and this is in October of '97. We're still in Kyoto, right? And there's a weather map back there, but this is a weather map for 200 years, and it's about what happens if we don't get together and, and make Kyoto the first step. So black is 125, over 120 degrees, and right there at George W.'s house. Anyhow, but they didn't know about that back then. Okay, it's a good thing they did it in the U.S. because if there were any other countries, he probably hasn't visited them. But in any case, I can tell you what my European friends say. You have a president who's not been to Europe? Well, anyhow, I said, don't worry. Condi has, it's all right. Okay, so here's this map. So they called me up and they said they're going to do this. And they said, how much warmer should we make it? I said, well, I don't know, 2 degrees, 4 or 5 degrees, 10 degrees. And they said, yeah, well, which one? I said, 2 degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees. Okay, what's up? And I said, well, you didn't tell me what the odds were. I mean, I can concoct a scenario with cheap solar machines discovered, with a globalized world, with egalitarian sharing, where people, quickly transfer efficient technology that ends up on the very low side. And I can imagine a gluttonous world with also unlucky positive feedbacks in the climate system, where we could have catastrophic, warming 10 or 15 degrees. She said, well, I don't want this to be science fiction. She said, what did you say the probability was at 10 degrees? I said, I don't know. It's subjective. It's Bayesian. It's my guts, my prior probability. 10%. What's your 2%? I don't know, 15 degrees. Well, that's what's there. Now, okay, it's not science fiction. There's a few percent chance that this could happen. And, but I wish that they had said that. That's my point. I don't like it when either side does that. I have a phrase for this. I call this courtroom epistemology. Not my job to make my opponent's case. It's the classical reason for lawyer jokes. On the other hand, if you're in trouble, then you sure don't want your lawyer making your opponent's case. I wouldn't either. So I understand it. In principle, I don't have a problem with courtroom epistemology if there were 3 conditions. A, judge is honest. B, the jury understands the arguments. And C, you've got all the time it takes for both sides to bring out the range of issues the truth can emerge. But what happens when the courtroom is public opinion? You have 20 seconds of a soundbite in the evening news, and you get 5 minutes to testify in Congress. The issues are complex, and people are trivializing them into the end of the world, and good for you. That kind of epistemology just fails. It's also in the archetype of science, although Sheila Jasanoff would argue that we don't come up to this archetype very well. But in the archetype of science, that's an immoral view. You have to give all the caveats and all the things wrong with your case. Otherwise, you're not being an honest scientist. The problem, of course, is that honest scientists can disagree because they have different Bayesian priors and they see different information. But the public needs to understand that as the process of science. So when I try to answer the question you asked me to talk about, which is how does science fit in, I wanted to go first through what that process is like.
Just give you a time that you got 20 more minutes, so I just want to make sure you get through.
Oh, sure. We're also doing discussion along the way. I have much more to do than that. I wanted to make sure that we got through these. Now, let me switch quickly to this meeting, to The Hague. So there we are in the land where you should be worried about sea level rise, right? Holland. I'm standing on a dike in The Hague. They don't look too worried. And then went out there on this pier. Did a little peer review. Anyhow, there it was. Now, that's got a lot of space. Awful lot of storms can come here. You can get a lot of sea level. And Greenpeace was there. And they built, so there's this innocent looking building. They had another penguin. And then they built a dike around it as the symbol. So here's the Greenpeace people who were in the red hats. There were a lot of people here who were actually not in Greenpeace, but who Greenpeace paid for it. They had a very well organized thing. I kind of liked it. I liked the dike. It was a very clever, good symbolic idea. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. Got a lot of publicity. People are now filling up sandbags, and they built a dike all around the negotiations. All sorts of signs. This reminded me of being back in the 60s again. So it says, "I'm all right, Jack. I'm all right, Jack. I'm all right, Jack." Bubble, bubble. You know. Don't destroy the climate treaty. And of course, the nuclear industry was there, saying, well, if you don't like fossil fuels, there's always us. You know? So then this group said, don't nuke the climate. The Dutch government, which was putting this on, they had these posters all around town, work it out. I was more in cahoots with Nike. I kept saying, just do it. And it doesn't make that much difference because, well, either way, it isn't going to matter very much in the end anyway. We need a 20-year experiment in cooperation. Let's get going. We'll worry about perfection next time. Then you go inside the meeting, and then this is different than Kyoto. And this shows a lot of progress in 3 years. All of a sudden, Kyoto people are arguing whether you should do it in principle. Now there are dot-coms and businesses all ready to do trades for you. The whole world is gearing up as if this is really going to happen. That actually is a good thing, because it shows that people are thinking about implementation issues. This happened to have been the nuclear table. Sorry, nuclear signal-noise ratio here. This says nuclear technology is the solution. They didn't have a lot of customers. It's clean electricity. I didn't go over to argue about whether, in fact, if they really want to get rid of all the rules which they claim make them cost so much money from the environment, if they're also willing to get rid of the Price-Anderson Act, which in the United States is the piece of legislation that limits the liability in any nuclear accident to about $500 million. Do you know if there were a nuclear accident what it would cost? What, 500 times that? If Chernobyl took place, if in fact the containment vessel in 3 Mile Island had broken, what the liability would have been. So if this technology is going to prove itself, never mind safety, if it's going to prove itself economically, can't get a subsidy from the government in forms of a limitation of liability. But we didn't do any of that. Nobody was at the table. Then there were other people. This is Aubrey Meyer, and he's got an idea which has been out there called Contraction and Convergence. There's two alternative philosophies. Philosophy A says that you should emit emissions on a national basis, and others say, no, that's not moral, because countries aren't equal, it should be population. The same debate we have here about electoral college versus popular vote. So his idea is that you have to contract the total emissions, but you can't do it right away, so you have to still increase because people have to develop. And then during this next 30 to 40-year period, while you're increasing emissions, taking further climate risk, you're working like mad to get yourself unhooked from this fossil fuel prop, and then you can come down, and then you converge, meaning that the per capita uses between the rich and the poor converge as the developing countries develop and become comparable. And I like the idea a lot, and he's going through. But all these booths are there, and it's now moved into the computer world. People have calculations everywhere. But remember, calculations are only as good as their assumptions. Then there was others there. This was new. Honduras is now willing to sell you rainforests, which it claims would otherwise have been deforested, and you get carbon credit. You just pay them to protect it. That's part of clean development mechanism. It's also a sequestration thing. Greenpeace was against that, by the way. They did not want sinks included in the treaty. I happen to have disagreed with them very strongly about that. If you can get primary forest protection paid for, why not? I mean, after all, what are you telling indigenous people who live in a forest when you say you have all this biodiversity to protect, don't use the forest? You're telling them you're going to lose the economic opportunity of being hired to cut down the tree. Now, that may not be sustainable, but it's a short-term way to feed your family. Therefore, if you're going to take that option away, you've got to provide an alternative opportunity. And it turns out that the amount of income that's lost in that operation is so small relative to the cost of retiring prematurely a coal-burning power plant that therefore letting a country like Japan or the US get credit for emissions cuts by protecting forests is a double benefit. And of course it should be in the treaty. But then you have to verify that the trees stayed there. So then you have to have a verification mechanism. And all these are complex issues that are being negotiated in all those side rooms that I'm talking about. And how you write the rules really matter. And that's part of the story. So what about sea level? It's an example. So there was the dike being built around the thing in the symbol of Holland. The Dutch are not worried about this problem. They are not worried about the oceans breaching their dikes. Their dikes are already built to sustain massive storms, and that raising the sea level a meter would change them from the 500-year risk to the 250-year risk. And they could still, well within a point of their GDP, raise them. The problem is Bangladesh. How are they going to do it? They haven't got the infrastructure. They haven't got the capacity to do that. They have people who are exposed by the hundreds of thousands to these kinds of storms. Rising sea level and intensifying storms, a death sentence there. In Holland, it's just a little more out of the GDP. And one of the points that's critical in the climate debate is not just a cost-benefit aggregation, but you have to take a look at the distribution of impacts. And when you do that, it turns out that the rich countries are not nearly as potentially threatened as the poorer countries for a variety of reasons. One is they're in the colder north, for which extra warming may or may not be a problem. And number two, they have the infrastructure and the resource capacity to invest in adaptations, much more so than developing countries trying to cope with just ordinary world without the stress of additional environmental change on their heads. So part of the reason why it's so difficult and why the science gets lost in the cacophony is that this problem is deeply engaged in the already existing debate about development and sustainable development, which is already filled with ideological views, angers, and different precepts of the way the world should be. And therefore, trying to argue 2 degrees versus 4 degrees in the midst of this sort of blindered mess where people have all these preconceptions of who's responsible for the world being the way it is and who's gotten rich and who's poor, it makes it very tough to cut that kind of science through. Plus, there are people out there deliberately trying to spin it their way. So Greenpeace, in their entertainment, they had a fossil of the day. So this is the scoreboard for the fossil of the day. They had wet fossils and deep fossils. They really are funny. Greenpeace makes me laugh, even though I don't agree with them about their perfect treaty because it just ends up killing the treaty. The U.S. won one. I guess New Zealand and Australia won a few. The U.S. got several at the end. So they had all these prizes at a press conference, and they were well attended because they are clever and they were pretty funny. And then they gave a Lifetime Achievement Award to Mohammed Al-Saban from Saudi Arabia because every single climate meeting he is the Philadelphia lawyer of opposition. And he's the one right now who's trying to get subjective probabilities removed from IPCC. And I was the one who spent 5 years trying to get them in. Over a lot of scientists' nervousness about being subjective. They like to maintain this myth that we're objective because we do experiments. But for the reasons I told you before, those experiments are not on the whole system. They're only on subcomponents of the system, so we're still subjective. And so they gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award. And then finally, the truth, where all real work took place, was in the bar. It's where I interviewed Andy Revkin. I mean, yeah, I got Alden Meyer from Union of Concerned Scientists, all different delegates here. And then, of course, that's where the business is truly conducted, including discussions of science. And in the midst of all this, science is getting talked about all the time. And back to Kyoto. In the height of all that political nonsense, the fossil dinosaur, and all this kind of stuff, what happens? Nobody's talking about science. So George Woodwell, the Woods Hole Research Institute, puts on a session, invites me to join it with Bob Watson, who's now the head of IPCC, and a couple of other people, and Pachori from Tata Energy Research Institute. So it's, balanced. Guy from Leonard Nurse from Trinidad, a small island state. People worried about no, he's from Barbados, from sea level rise. And so the topic was, does science matter? And I laughed. I said, you've got to be kidding, George. Nobody around here cares about that. They're spinning their politics. So we go to this session and he's confident, and he puts it in a room that can seat 300 people. Well, 10 minutes before the session was supposed to start, it was already standing room. I was stunned. I was really very pleased at this. And there were delegates missing sessions. The media showed up, NGOs. People were getting sick of spin. And then we had a long session about does science matter. And I remember Leonard saying, and he's a meteorologist, very good guy. And he says an IPCC, and he's also a Barbados delegate. And he said, every country doesn't care about science. They just grab any fact out of context or any measurement and then use it to spin a national preconception. And Watson gets up and he beats his chest and he says, we scientists have failed in communicating the range of what we know. That's all true. He's right. And finally I said, I don't know, I'm going to be in an unusual position. I'm an optimist. Because I remember this problem in 1970 when we didn't know if it's warming or cooling. I, in fact, thought cooling was more likely in the early days till we discovered that these hazes were regional and the greenhouse gases were global. And I remember the ozone debate. When it was first discovered that fluorocarbons would break down in the stratosphere, and the scientists who did it were vilified in full-page ads in the New York Times. They now have Nobel Prizes. And when as soon as the ozone hole opened up in Antarctica in the mid-'80s, the debate ended, and we had an international treaty to deal with it. Now, I'll concede two things. One, it's a lot easier to fix the fluorocarbon problem. It's a billion-dollar industry, not a $10 trillion industry, and not everybody's development hinges on it. And two, we had an ozone hole, which is a direct health threat. We don't have a climate hole yet, but we do have the warmest 50 years in the last 1,000 at least. We do have an increase in the probability of extreme events, and we have a pretty strong scientific consensus among those who know something that there's a substantial chance of damaging change. And the fact that we're even here is because the scientific community's persistent addressing of this issue, its report after report after report, has led to a cumulative impact to where people think maybe it's time to start doing something. So the fact is that Leonard is right. In any short-term event, science doesn't matter, and people don't listen, they spin. But over time, that building consensus is the only reason we were there. There wasn't a climate hole yet. It was, the evidence is just becoming out of the noise level. That is, the signal of human climate change is just emerging now, as we speak. Over the last few decades is the first time we've been able to discern it. So, therefore, people are being slowly anticipatory. And if you can step to the back of the room and take a 20-year perspective, science matters a lot, and its message gets through. If you live from event to event, it's all spin, politics, and political chicanery. So you've got to have that perspective. And at the Hague, and I'll end with this, I met a number of young people over at the NGO, the environmental NGO tent, which had strange sniffs in it that I'm glad the Dutch police ignored. But I met people who I didn't know. And they were the climate coordinator for this environmental group, or that environmental group. Was really quite an interesting challenge for my vanity when they didn't know who I was. Well, come on, in climate, you don't know who I am. Anyhow, what can you know? But what I also discovered is they didn't know very much about climate science and about those issues. And so finally, after things calmed down, and I said, how come you guys, what did you do before this? Well, I was in the ozone problem, and then I was in this problem. People are lasting 2-3 years, and one of the young ladies told me that this was climate burnout. And I said, well, what do you expect? Well, you know that we're going to get in here and we're going to get this treaty. I said, no, wrong idea. This is a generation-long problem. This is a problem in the development of global cooperation in the context of high suspicion about inequity in development status. Therefore, if you don't have a 25-year perspective, you are going to burn out. You have to go not from battle to battle, but you have to have a long sweep of history. And in that sense, science matters. And therefore, the community's continuous studying really does make a difference. And the fact that this particular Hague went down, I'm not that concerned with it. It came very, very close to a deal at the end, and it was 2 European ministers who backed out of it because they couldn't defend it to their green constituents at home because the U.S. was going to buy itself out too easily. And so the U.S. already compromised 80% of the way. What I'm worried about is with this administration, they may not even be willing to go 80%. So if it isn't this year, it'll be next year. And already it's making a difference. And you might say, how could it already be making a difference? Nobody signed the treaty. It's not just all these people sitting in the side of the room. An investment banker told me something that blew me away, and it was obvious. He said, oh, global warming is already figured into energy decisions. I said, why? And he said, because the Wall Street bankers have no passion. They just calculate it out. And what they do is they calculate out the probability that there'll be an international agreement. They then calculate the relative likelihood that that will impose an expense on various energy systems like fossil energy systems. And they've got a 50% chance that there'll be substantial taxes worth of $50 to $100 a ton of carbon. So you multiply it times 50, cut it in half, and they're now imputing for every loan they make to an energy company that that is a risk on their return on investment, and therefore that's already encouraging people to do non-fossil energy systems or to build gas rather than coal before anybody signed a thing. So in essence, the process is already slowly starting to work. Now, it's not nearly enough, but it's already slowly starting to work because people are beginning to believe that something's going to happen, because they're beginning to believe that maybe those crazy scientists, overcautious as they are in saying that we're not sure, but it looks like something's going to happen, are right. And the more people believe that, the higher the credibility that people will take action. The higher the credibility people take action, the more the investment banking community puts a risk flag on a coal-burning power plant. So that's changing, and the more we do, of course we have to do faster than that, the better it is. So I find this a rather exciting time if you have the capability of that step to the back of the room and take a long look. And I think we're moving forward on it, and I'm not that discouraged by the short-term losses because there's still forward progression, and the fact that China had a meeting at which it put an environment session in that they invited me to last week, that's all new. They used to deny it. They're not denying it. They now realize from their own air pollution problems that it's going to affect them too. That's another major step because you've got a substantial fraction of the world's people there and more enlightenment and leadership. And I even flew home sitting next to Senator Hagel's chief staff aide. We had a long talk. The senator gave a little private talk to the enviros there, and he said, all right, we stopped fighting with you about the science. We now concede that the science is coalescing, but we want to solve it cheaply. Okay, that's progress. So all these little elements are going to string together, and what we'll end up with is a mild Kyoto, is my guess, in the next few years. And that won't do very much. But what it will do is start the experiment so that we can then get people increasingly familiar with what really has to happen, which is a fundamental structural transformation in the economy, not the Victorian economy, industrial economy. And that is quite possible with high tech, but is not possible in less than a generation or two. And the longer we delay that transition, the more expensive it is, and if you delay, and then you have to do it all at once. That's more expensive than an orderly transition. And in that orderly transition, some people will be hurt because what they know how to do will no longer be a valued service. And they will be politically opposed, and they're out there, and they will continue to be out there, and we have to find ways to transition in a way that gives them a softer landing. Otherwise, they'll be, in opposition. And all of those things fit together and are the context into which the science fits.